my channel. Welcome back to another video. Welcome to my 2019 top 10 YA reads. My last video was my top queer reads of 2019, so feel free to check that out if you haven't already. I knew I wanted to make at least 2 list videos before I released my top 10 overall. In these videos, I don't do honorable mentions. You're either on the list or you're off the list. But I have an honorable mention, and that is All Boys Aren't Blue by George Johnson. I started this book on the 31st of December, and I was fucking blown all the way away. I'm only halfway through the book, and this is how heavily I have tabbed it. Every single page has a frickin' tab. Upon completion of the first chapter, I was completely hooked, blown away, so impressed by how eloquent and immersive the first chapter was. And then I turned the page and it said chapter 1. The prologue of this book
was so amazing.
I thought it was the actual book. All Boys Aren't Blue comes out in April of 2020, and I'm using this as a way to pressure y'all to pre-order this book because I'm not even done and I was considering putting it on this fucking list. I was agonizing about whether or not to include this book on the list anyway, even though I'm only halfway through. That's how incredible it is. It's a collection of essays from George M. Johnson, who is an LGBTQIA activist and a Black man, and the essays are about toxic masculinity and being gender non-conforming and queerness and growing up and coming of age and Blackness, and mark my words, this book will be on at least one of my top 10 books of 2020's list.
I can already tell.
Now for the actual video, number 10 of my top YA reads of 2019 is Black Enough by Evie Zaboy. This is a collection of short stories by Black authors, each talking about what their Blackness means to them. We have this idea in the Black community that there's only one way to be Black. If you're too light, you can't be Black. If you don't use AAVE, then you're not Black enough. If you didn't grow up in the hood, then you're not Black enough. And so it's about the respectability and the identity politics that we force upon ourselves. And I loved especially the essays about the intersection of queerness and Blackness, because there's this ridiculous idea in the Black community that you can't be Black and be queer. If you're queer, it means that you're anti-Black, which is so freaking ridiculous and misguided and such a colonial way of thinking. But I really enjoyed this anthology. A lot of people didn't because they don't like anthologies. I personally love anthologies, and I go into my anthologies with a very specific mindset. It's about how well each of the stories play into the overall theme of the book. This is going to be my personal opinion, and it's going to be an unpopular one, but I don't think the best way to read an anthology is by tallying up the ratings of each individual stories and then creating an average and finding out, like, if that's what you want to do, that's cool, that's valid, it's your choice how to read and review and enjoy a book. Nobody can take that from you. But stories in an anthology aren't accepted for how they stand alone as individual pieces. They are accepted for how well they fit into the narrative of the whole. And so if you're looking at them on an individual level, you're misunderstanding the concept of the anthology, the point of the anthology. In terms of how well this book explored what it means to be a young Black person was just incredible. Of course, there were stories in here that I thought weren't incredibly well written, but they each played into the whole to create an overall vision that was absolutely astounding. I think she did an incredible job of editing and putting all of these stories together. Number 10 on the list is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas.
It's number 9, and I just realized my bow tie is upside down. Please kill me.
I was so freaking scared going into this book. I didn't trust that a YA book that had done so well and was so well received wouldn't somehow pander to white audiences. And what I mean by that is I was concerned that the issue of police brutality and anti-Blackness and racism would be watered down so that either white readers could digest it or so that white readers wouldn't feel attacked and threatened by it. And I don't feel that Angie Thomas pandered to white audiences at all with this. She didn't shy away from the issue. She tackled it head on without any fear, and I have so much respect for how she navigated the issue in this book. This book, of course, is about a young teenager named Star she's pulled over with one of her best friends. The police officer gets scared and shoots and kills her best friend, who is a young black boy. Star goes back and forth between like a really posh school in the suburbs, but also has a history of coming from a disadvantaged neighborhood. So it's about class privilege and how Star isn't considered black enough in some circles because of where she goes to school. The issue of race was explored so well in this book, but my two favorite themes of the book were about how to deal with toxic friendships and also ratchet girls. There's a character in this book who is seen as ghetto and ratchet and that angry black girl, and her character was handled with so much empathy and love, and I felt like Angie Thomas was 100% saying like, yo, this girl's perspective is valid. The way that she sees the world is valid. This type of black girl matters too. We have this really bad habit of only uplifting and listening to black girls who are very calm, who talk a certain way, who are respectable. We are so afraid to listen to angry black girls. We love writing off and stereotyping loud black girls and angry black girls and refusing to listen to them. So that was really, really dope, and Star kind of gets called out on being one of those people. I also loved the themes about toxic friendships because Star has to make the choice of whether or not she should walk away from a friendship that is toxic. We romanticize toxic friendships, and we romanticize the idea of just helping somebody work through their toxicity. And while, yeah, it's totally important to be able to work through your friends when you have conflict, that's such an important tool. We are encouraged to run away and avoid conflict with our friends, and it's so unhealthy.
But
Black people have the right to walk away from friendships when their friend is racist and refusing to change. People have the right to walk away from relationships that are otherwise hurtful, and people shouldn't be shamed for walking away from those relationships just because we're expected to fix the other person.
no.
It's unfair to expect the person who's being hurt to coddle and fix and carry the other person into enlightenment at the expense of their own mental health. I wish this was something that I had learned as a kid because I was friends with white girls who were very, very racist, who said awful things to me and about me in front of my face and behind my back. But I kept being their friend because I was taught by society that you stick with your friends no matter what. And I was taught by society that I don't have the right to stand up to racism, or that I don't have the right to walk away from friends who are being racist towards me because that makes me weak, it makes me sensitive. And so as a result, I put myself through a lot of degradation and disrespect in the name of friendship. Then we have The Bells. The Bells is about a young girl named Camille. She wants nothing more than to work in the palace and practice her magic there. She lives in a society that is based off of New Orleans, and in this society, beauty is power. People are born gray, and it takes the work of a belle in order to bring color to somebody's skin or to their hair and to make them beautiful. Now, a belle can redesign a person's body and make them tall or short or curvy. The Bells are very sought after, and it's about her trying to get into the palace and to be named the top belle, but also what happens when she realizes that life in the palace isn't exactly what it seems. I read the sequel this year and I did not love it anywhere near as much as the first, but I loved the lush writing. I just loved the world building. The magic that the Bells have is subject to so many different conditions and principles, and I thought that was really cool. There were a lot of restrictions on it. They couldn't just wave their hands and then the magic was performed. And it has so much social commentary on beauty standards. I met the author Danielle Clayton at the Well-Read Black Girl Festival, and Danielle talked about how a lot of people miss the fact that wealthy people in the society tend to want dark skin the most and black features the most. And she was using this as direct commentary on the way that the beauty industry sells and promotes black features while simultaneously degrading black women and black people. She also talked about the reason that all of the animals in the story are teacup size is direct commentary on how black girls are never allowed to kind of geek out over cute things and be feminine and girly. And so that's why she made all the animals in the story little and small, because she was creating an ode to, you know, really shy and girly and feminine black girls, because black girls are expected to be strong and loud and powerful and confident. Ultimately, I ended up rating this book 4 stars instead of 5 because I had issues with the romance, but my issues with the romance were addressed in the second book. After reading the second book, you can see why the romance was depicted the way that it was in book 1. It was done totally intentional. It was done for a very, very specific purpose, and I applaud that purpose, so I went back and I changed my rating to 5 stars. This is why I sometimes wait before rating the first book in a series, because it's not until the second book comes out that you get the full picture. I am so grateful for this book, like incredibly grateful, because I think out of all of the books on the stack, this is probably the one that I needed the most as a kid. Not because I was particularly girly, but because as a kid, I was so frustrated by the fact representation that I did get for Black girls was all the same, right? The Black female character was always so confident and so bold and strong and sure of herself. She was never allowed to be delicate or feminine or pretty. She was never seen as the most beautiful. And just the centering of Black beauty in the story and of girlhood, there's some queerness in it, the world building, the lush descriptive writing, I loved everything about it. Now, number 7 on this list is On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. I read this in audiobook form and I really enjoyed it. I connected to the themes much more than I did the themes in The Hate You Give, because they were just more personal to my experiences. On the Come Up is about this young girl named Bree who wants desperately to be a rapper like her father, who unfortunately has passed away. But she's dealing with a lot. She and her family are really struggling financially. Her mother is a recovering addict and she's constantly worrying about her mother relapsing. She and her brother are really close and their relationship is a big cornerstone of her life. There's some feelings developing between her and her best friend and she doesn't know if he feels the same way. And it's also about how these security guards at school attack and brutalize her and humiliate her. And so it covers the way that Black kids get treated in the school system. Now, the reason that I connected to this story so much is because a large part of it is about what it's like to be a Black teenage student. And it talks about how we criminalize our Black kids early. We teach people to treat Black kids as problems well before they actually ever become them.
A true story.
I once got in trouble for raising my hand too often to answer questions in school.
I will repeat that. I once got detention because a teacher felt that I was answering too many questions.
I was giving serious answers to questions that she asked, and to this day, I have never seen a white student get in trouble for that. I frequently was in detention as a kid for things that I should not have even been put in detention for. This was such an issue, my mother had to take off work and go to the school and argue with my all-white teachers about how racist they were treating me. There was another time when I was in school, I got yelled at because another kid was talking and the teacher just assumed it was me. So she turned and started yelling at me. And it took not only me, but like, I think it was like 6 or 7 white kids in the classroom being like, no, like Jessie didn't even say anything. That was Luke. Like, it was a boy who was talking and creating ruckus. It was a white boy, but she automatically assumed it was me, even though I rarely ever spoke in class. You can ask anybody who knew me growing up. I was not a social kid. I kept to myself. I was really shy. I had anxiety. And a big part of the anxiety that I had was because people were so often treating me like I was a problem. Black boys get criminalized in school 10,000 times more, especially if you're a dark-skinned Black person. This is a huge issue. So for me, being like a pretty nerdy, quiet, relatively light-skinned Black student, I can only imagine what it was like to be Black and none of those things. Other Black kids got it so much worse than I did. There were times where like I was so frustrated for what Bree was going through, and it hit me so hard that I almost cried because it gave me flashbacks. Honestly, like, school was a huge source of trauma for me. The trauma that I experienced in school was mostly from teachers and the principal and staff that were supposed to be there to protect me and help me grow. You know, I'm sorry, I went on a tangent. As you can see, it's still a very sensitive and triggering topic for me, but yeah, depiction of that whole thing was so personal to me, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars just because there were parts of the writing that I really didn't connect to. I thought the writing in The Hate You Give was a lot better, a lot stronger, but thematically, that book was my heart. Also some issues with the plot and the end of the book, the way that the book was wrapped up, that I was like. Then we have a book called Color Me In. I freaking loved this book. This is a debut by a biracial author, and it's about a young poet named Nevaeh. Nevaeh is Black and Jewish. She comes from a family that's fairly well off because her father is a pretty accomplished lawyer. He and her mother have gotten a divorce. Her mother has developed pretty severe mental health issues as a result of the divorce and has alienated Nevaeh. The book is about her trying to figure out what it means to be Black and Jewish, and it's also about her trying to navigate this like really expensive posh school that her father puts her in while going home to her mother's neighborhood, which is full of disadvantaged Black and brown kids. There's a lot of poetry in this book, and I loved Nevaeh's poetry. Sometimes when there's poetry in young adult books, the poetry isn't good. It's a little Rupi Kaur.
Poet of the decade, my ass.
But the poetry in this book is so freaking good. The representation for spoken word, I absolutely loved. I loved the book because it talks so much about colorism and favoritism in communities of color, how we favor lighter skinned people in our own communities. Vea has to navigate her light skin privilege. So she struggles to like assert herself as a black person, but also to acknowledge the fact that she has a ton of privilege. And I loved that representation there. The conversation was handled so well and in so much depth, and it wasn't her just like whining about being light-skinned and how hard her life was, but it also wasn't about her ignoring the fact that she does have that privilege. It was so freaking well done. I also love the representation for New York City because part of my childhood was spent in New York City growing up, and I just fucking loved it. I thought that rep was so well done, and the complex relationship between parents was dope. Nevaeh has to recognize that her dad is fucking garbage and figure out what that means. So I really liked the representation for how to handle having a shitty parent. But then she also has to handle the fact that her mom has a mental illness and is not there for her. And the fact that her mom isn't there for her in her time of need is rough. So like, how do you have a mental illness that's very active and deal with being a good parent? That was the same exact issue that was depicted in Patsy, which I talked about in my top LGBTQ reads of 2019. If complex parenting and mental illness is like an important topic to you, especially as it centers Blackness, definitely check out this book. Check out that video because I give a full kind of review of that book and also talk about like potentially triggering content. I ended up knocking down my rating to Color Me In because readers pointed out that there's some fat-phobic language in the book that I miss, and I was so glad that somebody else caught it and pointed it out. So do be aware that there is some fat phobia in this book. Nevaeh's best friend is also a big part of the book. He is queer, and I really, really appreciated that he didn't just feel like a side character who was just being used for his queerness. Coming in at number 5, we have another debut, The Stars and the Blackness Between Them by Donato Petrus. This is a female-female romance that follows both a Trinidad girl and a Black American girl living in Minneapolis and how the two of them come together. I'm not gonna talk in too much depth about this one because I have talked about it in like my last 4 videos, I feel like, in some way, and I don't want to be repetitive. But I will say this is like the ultimate book if you are into the zodiac or if you are a water sign. It's really, really great for representation of that struggle between like loving the church, but also loving yourself as a queer person and what that means and how to deal with homophobia in your communities. It's also just like a coming of age story on top of that, which I really, really loved. And there's so much heavy representation for music. How like music is such a centric part of Black identity and of life in general, and like how you can use music to heal and get you through hard times. It just was fucking cool. It was so cool. My favorite character in this book is Queenie. Queenie by far. Queenie is Audrey's grandmother, and she's a very spiritual, magical character. Queenie says some of the most profound things, and it's Audrey's connection to the ancestors, and there are parts of the book where we get to follow Queenie's perspective, and I just love elder main characters in my books. I think that we don't include enough representation for elder people in our books. There's also such a heavy theme in this book about ancestral power and how we can take power by knowing who our ancestors were, what they did, how they lived their lives, how we can draw inspiration from them. It just was so freaking well done. I highly recommend the audiobook if you are able to listen to books on audio. As far as the visibility and representation in this book, there's visibility for gender neutrality and being non-binary, as well as for being Muslim. These characters and topics are merely included in the book, but they are not central to the story at all. And just the way that non-binary identity was handled was just so nice to see and normalized, and it wasn't made a big deal, which I appreciated. The type of visibility and representation that I enjoyed the most was for Audrey's curviness. Audrey is a very, very curvy girl, and I loved the discussion about what it means to be curvy in society, especially to be Black and curvy in society, because we don't center the voices of curvy girls enough. And I really enjoyed the slow burn of the romance. Audrey and Mabel's relationship just crawls to it's like crawling to the top. Okay, you know how the roller coaster goes up the track very slowly and then you just kind of plummet down? That's kind of what it was like, except instead of plummeting down, it kind of went down in a very measured and realistic way. It wasn't like we were building up and then all of a sudden it was insta love, I'm obsessed with you, I can't live without you. It was a slow build up and then can ease into a really exciting and powerful bond and connection between the two of them. I don't know if that made any sense.
No, It didn't.
But one of the girls also has a chronic illness. So if you were looking for that type of disability rep, that is explored in depth, and I highly, highly recommend. And I will say this, as I've said in any video where I've mentioned this book, Black representation is great, but the representation for Trinidad and for the Creole language has been criticized by Trinidad reviewers. Even though Janata, the author, is Trinidad American, we have to remember that just because a book is from an own voice's perspective doesn't automatically mean that the rep will be good. This is why it's so important to read multiple books about a culture, because not one book can represent an entire culture. Book number 4 is a huge surprise to me.
Who taught you to count? I'm calling the police.
And that is The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. Now, I know that my good friend Rachel of Rachel Marie's book journey didn't like this book. And I know of some other really good friends in the community who didn't like this book.
What's wrong with y'all?
Let me stop teasing y'all. So this book is about 15-year-old Lee, who is coping with the loss of her mother to suicide. Lee is a biracial girl. She has a white American dad and a Taiwanese American mom. Her mother was an incredibly talented pianist, and Lei herself is a really talented painter and artist. And pretty shortly after her mother's death, she begins to see this giant red bird. At first, she's like,
What the fuck is that?
I cannot remember if the pronunciation for her name was stated in the book. I can't remember if it's Lee or Lei, but feel free to correct me down below. She believes that this bird is her mother, and that it's her mother's way of telling her that she wants her to go to Taiwan and connect with her heritage. Her father takes her to Taiwan, and she meets her grandparents for the first time. Her mother refused to talk about their homeland or teach Lei any of the language or anything like that, so she's meeting that half of herself for the first time, and also going on a journey to search for her mother as this giant bird. A lot of people fell in love with this book for the lush and lyrical writing, and I was no exception. I loved the writing, okay? And there's a plot twist in this book that had me so
shook.
There are 3 major plot twists that shook me in 2019, and this was number 3. It blew my mind. If you saw the plot twist coming, comment down below. Like if you did or didn't see it, comment down below. But make sure you don't spoil it for anybody else. Just thematically, it was brilliant. I loved the execution. I loved the exploration of what it means to have a mentally ill parent, and of depression and suicide. Also of being biracial and trying to handle having both sides of yourself and reconnecting with family history. And I loved the familial storytelling, how we see things through different family members' perspectives at different points in the book, but in a way that was so illustrative and creative. I don't want to say too much about the book, because I just think it's one of those things that you have to go into it with an open mind, and you have to be aware that it's going to be a very spiritual book. I would describe it as contemporary spiritual realism. And yeah, it just honestly meant so much to me, and I loved the grandparents. The grandparents and Axel, who is the best friend, were my favorite characters in the book. Holy freaking crap, we have only 3 books left. Number 3 on this list is Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. I had the greatest experience buddy reading this with Jess of Jess Nicole Dickerson. This is a young adult thriller about a girl named Claudia who is searching for her best friend named Monday. Monday goes missing over the course of a summer. Claudia notices that her friend isn't around, and she starts asking questions, and nobody seems to care. The school doesn't care. Monday's mom doesn't seem to care. Her parents don't seem to care. The police damn sure don't care. And so it's about Claudia going to look for this missing black girl. And it's commentary on how society treats black girls, black kids when they go missing. This is a topic that I actually did research on in college. The conclusion of my research was that black kids, when they go missing, not only are given shorter newspaper articles than white kids, but they're given less on-screen time, and they are more likely to be assumed as runaways, which then leads to an epidemic of missing black kids. A lot of predators kidnap black kids because they know that nobody gives a fuck about missing black children. So this book did a really excellent job of tackling that topic, but also was just so freaking good. I read it and physically and listened to the audiobook, and both were phenomenal in my opinion. It is somewhat of an epistolary novel because you get chapters from Claudia and Monday's journals, but even outside of the main theme of the book, you get to see a lot of exploration of family, of poverty, of gentrification, of mental illness in the black community, and how being poor triggers mental illness, and how a lot of people in poor communities have untreated mental illnesses that are a direct result of growing up and living in poverty and oppressive communities. So all of that was just freaking amazing. And then on top of that, I loved Claudia's family. She had this amazing family. Like, her parents really cared about her. They were working class. And I just really liked seeing depiction of a Black family that wasn't just struggling and toxic and abusive. I feel like most of the representation that we get for Black families are just like broken and trauma, and it was just really nice to see a Black girl with a nice family. I also really loved that there's representation for being a dancer in this book. Claudia is a dancer. It just was really, really cool to see the dance representation and the lifestyle of a dancer in this book, so I just fucking loved that. And I just talked about how The Astonishing Color of After was my third plot twist of the year, and Monday's Not Coming was my second. I did not see the twist coming in this book. I was fucking shook.
She shook me all night long.
Shook. Oh my freaking gosh. And I will say that the thriller aspect of this book does not get dropped. There's a lot of horror in this book. Like, it's not just thriller. There's just straight up horror in this book. There is a scene in this book that is just gruesome and just so uncomfortable to read. So if you want like a good YA thriller, I would definitely put this on the list. And if you can recommend a really good YA thriller, definitely do so down below, because I love YA thrillers so much and I'm always looking for recs on them. Now it is time for book number 2 on my list of the top YA books I read in 2019. And let me just say that this was such a hard pick. Like, it was so hard for me to decide between my number 1 book and my number 2 book, because I love them both so deeply. And if you follow me on Instagram and have been watching my Black Girl Magic series, you probably won't be surprised to find out that my second favorite YA read of 2019 was Slay by Brittany fucking Morris. This is just the debut of the century. Holy freaking amazing author. This book is about 17-year-old Kiara, who is a gamer. She's a wickedly talented and intelligent student who's just super tired of all of the racism that she experiences online in the gaming community. So she decides to create a virtual reality world where Black nerds can go and be themselves and not have to worry about racism, which of course is called Slay, and it's a place where Black folks can just duel each other and have a good time. And unfortunately, there's a dispute over something that happens in the Slay world and a kid ends up dead, and that gives people fuel to the fire to call the game racist and to denounce its existence. So there starts to be a huge hunt for the creator of Slay, and nobody realizes that it's 17-year-old Kiara, and her family doesn't even know that she created Slay. It also has just such fantastic casual non-binary inclusion in the story that I really appreciated. Even outside of the inclusion of non-binary language, I loved how this book was just a celebration of all the ways a person can be Black. You get different perspectives from people who slay throughout the book. There are so many conversations about like how to deal with racism in your life, and also about hotepery, the first contemporary YA book I've ever read that had the phrase hotep in it. And I was shook. And the way that hotepery was explored and examined and critiqued, everything that Brittany did in this book, she did well. And I don't even want to talk about it too much. The book speaks for itself. I don't have to talk about what's in this book. You should just read it. Oh, I should also say though, that the world building in this game is amazing. Slay felt so real, and the level of detail that Brittany Brittany put into building the world of Slay was incredible. So I think that if you are a gamer at all, you'll really appreciate it. My dream is that Slay will get made into a real virtual reality game. I want to see this as a movie adaptation so bad, like more than anything. And last but not least, it is time for my top YA read of 2019. In February of 2019, I hosted Blackathon with Lauren from the novel Lush and Francina Simone. I read, I think, like 20 books for Blackathon. And I read the book I'm about to show you. And I said in a video that this was going to be my top YA book of the year. I said that I would be shocked if I read a YA book, or really any book, that was better than this one. And I was really sad that I read it early on in the year, because I just had this feeling that every other book that came after it would have to compete with this fucking amazing book. And I was super, super sad about that. So if you do read this book, read it towards the end of the year. Mind you, I read this book last February. And all throughout the year, things would remind me of it. I would think about it. I would remember how the book made me feel. Like, the book always felt like it was still in the room with me.
Oh my God, it was so good.
And that book is Let's Go Swimming on Doomsday by Natalie C. Anderson. If you like truly morally ambiguous characters, not just characters who are pretty much good but make some slightly questionable decisions, you need to read this book. So this book is about 16-year-old Abdi, who lives through the unthinkable when his older brother is kidnapped by terrorist group Al-Shabaab. 3 years after the fact, Abdi himself and his entire family is kidnapped. Hoods are placed over their head, they're thrown into cells, and Abdi is tortured for 3 days straight. At the end of his torturing, the hood gets pulled off of his head, and he learns that his captives are none other than the CIA, and that the CIA want him to infiltrate Al-Shabaab in order to get close to his brother, who now has become a leader in the organization. So Abdi, up until this point, has thought that his brother was killed. The CIA basically says, if you don't do this, we will kill your entire family. And the book is about him trying not to be brainwashed, him trying to survive, him having to do some awful things in order to keep his cover. And there's just like a little hint of romance. It oscillates between the future and the past, and it leaves off at just the right moments. You definitely see that he has PTSD, and it just talks so much about what boys go through in war. It has commentary on the role that the United States plays in creating terror throughout Africa. And this is not an Own Voices story, but it was written by a woman who spent the last decade working NGOs and also doing work for refugee liberation. I absolutely loved the afterword in this book, where she talks about what it means for her to be white and writing this story, her acknowledging the potential issues with her writing this story from her perspective and the inherent white lens that she brings into the story. And so I really appreciated her being so upfront about that. That's literally all I ever ask when somebody is writing a story that is basically not theirs to tell. The writing was absolutely phenomenal. And I loved Abdi with every fiber of my being. I loved the PTSD rep. I loved the messages about triumph and hope, and I've been thinking about this book all year, and I think that you should read it. Of course, there's triggering content in this book. There are so many content warnings that I can provide for various types of violence, so just be aware going into this book. I do have a full review of this book on my Goodreads. I'll link it down below so that you can check it out if you would like to kind of read over the reviews before potentially picking this up. But yeah, I obviously am a huge fan of this book, and I really think that you will be too. I tried to convince people to read it earlier on in the year, and I don't know that I succeeded. I haven't seen anybody pick this up but me, which is such a shame, because out of all the bad books that got hyped in 2019, y'all could have just been reading this one. I would love to know if any of these books weren't on your radar and they now are, or if I've convinced you to read any of these books. Please let me know if you're gonna read Let's Go Swimming on Doomsday in particular, because just my life, I don't buy books without reading them. I broke that rule a few times last year,
And it bit me in the ass.
every time. I read this book through my library and I purchased it immediately after. I did the same thing with Freshwater by Akweke Emezi. Also, just like, this cover is fucking gorgeous. Thank you so much for watching another Bowties and Books production. The next video you're gonna see from me will be my top 10 reads of 2019 overall. Definitely stay tuned for that video. You may or may not see a book or two from this list in that video. Who knows? You'll have to stay tuned in order to find out. And then pretty shortly after that, you will see me talk about all of the books in 2019 that wasted my time the most. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one.